Okay. Welcome, everyone. Pleasure to see you. For those who were out with us on the hike Tuesday, last week, thanks for coming. We got to see some short-eared owls and some harrier hawks, and that was a lot of fun. Anyway, let me just hit the lights just a little bit. So as always, we are just so lucky to live in such a beautiful area, just so full of the great biodiversity we have. And if this is of interest of yours, you have kindred spirits. There are all of these environmental organizations like this one where did the website go? You're right there. Well, look at you. All right, well, anyway, so I'm not quite sure why. Oh, all right, so that's weird. Anyway, but like if you're interested in the local Audubon Society, they have a website with presentations and hikes and etc. The Bashkill Area
For extra credit
Association,
Zoom.
the Bashkill Area Association has not only hikes and presentations at the Mamakating Environmental Education Center, but in about a month, if anyone is interested, uh, there's two things going on. One, there's a little crew that will be trained on warm spring rainy nights to help salamanders across the road so they don't get hit by cars. If anyone says, "Oh, I love nothing better to do on warm rainy spring nights," then you would be most welcome. And then also, if you're interested in visiting or if you're interested in volunteering, in about a month, there'll be a training for a Nature Watch program, which on weekends will have volunteers next to spotting scopes on eagles' nests. We have to wait for the water to melt to figure out which of the eagles' nests are going to be active this year. But if you were looking to get out and volunteer and share your wisdom about birds and other wildlife, you would be most welcome. The point is, there are lots of environmental educations with lots of great people. So if this is an interest of yours, whether it be on hikes or some of these other activities, there's lots of little communities forming. I was going to introduce the talk for tonight, but were there any like issues as far as just some housekeeping business? Dorothy, did you have anything to share?
No, except that if I may have last week, I'm not sure that I am working with Dr. Corey Harris with archaeology, anthropology. Um,
I'll repeat this at home for people at home.
the discovery of the mastodon. Well, so hopefully you, I'm springing on you, but I know that we have one topic on April 14th.
Mhm.
So I'm hoping somewhere in that neighborhood we can have a talk.
Oh, sure, that'd be great.
The professor, and also during the daytime as well.
Okay. Sure, I'm sure we can work something. So Dorothy, head of cultural affairs, was just announcing that we're hoping to organize some talks on the discovery of a mastodon that was occurred over the summer. Orange County was for a while. I don't think it is anymore, but it's close. The mastodon capital of, I think, North America, maybe, yeah, to at least North America.
Why we have black septic.
Yes.
So many of them died there and make terrific soil.
So at some point we can certainly, so we were looking at, sometime in the future, we'd like to incorporate that into our talks as well. So as we consider this great biodiversity, we would like to spend 2 weeks on invertebrates. Now, if I were to just start off, right, if I were to ask everyone, just take a second, think of an animal and shout it out. Think of an animal. Name an animal. Elephant.
Bear.
Bear. Dragonfly, we'll stop at 10. All right, we got some people going online. Oh, great, we got 3 online. We got Love the Infant Tiger.
Trilobite.
Cat. I'm sorry, someone at home, what'd you say?
Trilobite.
Trilobite. Slow. Okay. Wow. Okay. So you are already an exceptional group, and I'll say why. When I ask this, there's no wrong answers. But when I ask it of a class, almost sheep, very good. Almost always, I'll get 10 mammals. All right. So when I ask to name an animal, there are more animals than that. In fact, there are well over 1.5 million animal species known. Mammals make up 4,000. But if you ask people like, to name some animals, I think very often, some of our things like elephant, tiger, sheep, cat, like those are the, people, dogs, those are the things which often leap to mind. Every now and then in my classes, someone will mention a bird. Sometimes someone mentions a fish or a snake or a turtle. Those are all good answers, but those are vertebrates. So all of the vertebrates, they equal 40,000 of the 1.5 million species. So, obviously we're not even touching. Almost all of the other ones are invertebrates. So there was a slug, there was a trilobite, there was a dragonfly. So this group has, I would probably need to teach like 4 or 5 classes to get that number of invertebrates named here. So I'd like to mention them for a couple of reasons. One, as far as the species go, they make up over the overwhelming majority. In fact, I've got more songs than I can fit in tonight, so I won't steal from next week. But there are 4 kinds of insect. The beetles, the flies, the butterflies, and the butterflies and moths, and what am I forgetting? The wasps. Those 4 have as many species as all other life on Earth combined. So if you take the plants, the fungi, all other animals, that number of species equals the beetles, the flies, the wasps, and the moths. So just, there are so many species of invertebrates. Now, there's more than just species, all right, because we could just weigh them. So if you were to weigh all of the wild birds on Earth, they would weigh that much on the scale. Welcome, all the wild mammals, a little bit more. Nematodes, a lot of people don't even know what nematodes are, even though like just to get here, you probably walked on a gazillion of them. Heck, I'll bet you might even have a couple on you. We got those. We got humans. All right, there are a lot of humans on Earth. Livestock, so this would be a whole nother conversation. Like if you look at humans and the animals that feed us and look at how much they outweigh all wild mammals and all wild birds. That's a whole nother conversation, but that's something. But then we get to cnidarians, jellyfish, corals, and their friends. We get to annelids that we will be talking about today. We get to mollusks. I probably jumped the gun. I apologize. If you want to jump in, fine. That's awesome, but I'll just mute someone who might not realize that their mic is on. So if you get like earthworms and leeches and their friends, if you get mollusks, you get fish, there's a lot of fish. But if you include the arthropods, so here's fish, the second bar, there's arthropods. So if you weigh animals on Earth, clearly the mammals that we name, once again, like if someone asked me to name an animal, and very often I'm thinking people and dogs and cats, but obviously, once again, the mammals are way down there. All right, just as far as the weight of animal mass, invertebrates, particularly the arthropods, are by far the majority. Now, there's so many there's so many species and so much like that's why this is divided into 2. So the arthropods are definitely next week, maybe the chordates. All right, so arthropods next week, maybe the chordates. And so I'd like to introduce a lot of other groups as well. Because if we were to, I don't know, the last or 2 more reasons that invertebrates are interesting to discuss is really, I thought I had something more. Where is that other one? Oh, there we go. Okay. When animals first appear in the fossil record, all right, which wasn't for most of it. On the very last days of class of this series, if you wanted to walk the stairway, I've tried to create like a 3-dimensional walk through geologic time, if that's a little more interesting to you. But our planet is about 4.5 billion years old. We definitely know that life was around for 3.5 billion years, maybe 3.8. Animals don't appear until 700 million years ago. So about 3 billion years of life's 3.5, 3.8 billion years goes without any animals. So animals weren't here for most of it. All right. But if you say, I want to study fossils of animals, great. All right. Starting 700 million years ago, there are fossils of animals. And they look like this and this, and they're invertebrates. Vertebrates don't come till later. And things like the mammals, once again, the ones we all name, they're like far in the future. So another reason to talk about the invertebrates is when it comes to animals, they evolve first. Now, something I'm going to work into this presentation. This sounds biased, and I've said this before. I'm biased. I'm a little egotistical. I like all these things. I do, but I like me. Like I really just, if something has to do with me, like I study it a little more than something that doesn't have to do with me. But that's why I like the invertebrates. All right, because, once again, little boastful here. I'm kind of impressed with my brain and by extension yours. Um, but they were the ones who invented the brain. All right, like we just made it bigger. We just took what was already there and just said grow a little bit more, organize it a little bit different. They were the ones who made it. They were the ones who made nerve cells that could detect light and work as eyes. They were the ones who said, here's a nerve cell that conducts electricity. So when I think about me, which I do, and I'm impressed by this complexity, a lot of it didn't start with mammals. A lot of it started, hundreds of millions of years ago with these guys. So as I go through these, that's kind of one of the things I like. I kind of see my organization, by extension ours, slowly coming together. So with that, what are the first animals like? Well, I'll be honest. We could argue over sponges. So I'll present what most people would say, but to be honest, uh, if you're going to find a fossil of a soft-bodied little thing, all right, that doesn't have hard parts, you could argue over like, is this like, a really big protist? Is this a blobby thing? Is this an embryo? And so I just want to point out, I'm going to talk about sponges being first. We could kind of argue about, you know, where sponges are because there's a couple of other very primitive animals. But I just, to be honest, these are the most primitive animals today. These and one other group that you've never heard of. So sponges, they're animals, all right? We know, or we're pretty sure that they exist as of 700 million years ago, before there were fish, before there were arthropods, before there were mollusks. So if we're going to put them on the family tree, these are ancient things. Now, I love this picture here from the coral reef, but if it's okay, let's just kind of go to a microscopic view. Here's a sponge under the microscope. All right, now there's things I like. It's multicellular. Like a lot of the amoebas and paramecia, like one cell is the organism, whereas you and me, it's the group. All right, a cell is nothing. It's the group of cells that makes the organism. And the way all those cells hold together is because they bind to collagen. You look at a sponge, collagen is its most abundant protein. There's more collagen there than any other protein. And the same is true of me and every other animal. All right, like collagen, it makes up a quarter of my bone. It makes up my tendons and my ligaments. It makes up the dermis of my skin. It makes up the white of my eye. I have more collagen protein than anything else. So do the sponges. This is the extracellular protein that all of these cells get to hang on to. So this was an animal thing. When animals started, they say the group of us is going to be the individual. Let's all hold on to collagen and other extracellular proteins. And we still do that. Now, sponges not only go way back in the fossil record, right, and they do. So for example, here's a group called an archaeocyathene, all right? And I'm going to say something. I don't want to rock the boat too much. I hope I don't offend anyone. The Flintstones lied to us. Just saying. When you watch the Flintstones, Dino the dinosaur was hanging around with the people, which was hanging around with the saber-toothed cat. And to be honest, it wasn't like that. And just like when we consider history, and I'm sure a lot of people here are interested in human history, the Huns lived in the past. The Egyptian pharaohs lived in the past. The Roman Empire lived in the past. The Mayans lived in the past. That didn't mean they hung out together. All right. I mean, the past is a long time. All right. So just because George Washington and Attila the Hun are figures of the past doesn't mean they were together. And the same thing if you were to say, all right, well, we're going to talk about trilobites next time, but just to make a point, when did different groups of trilobites live? Well, some kinds of trilobites are only known from this first period of the Paleozoic, starting 500 million years ago, the Cambrian. Others are only known from the Ordovician. Other ones are only known from the Devonian. There are types of corals that are only known from here. So when I'm going to use the term coral presently, modern corals start here. All right, so when corals start, they're a kind that we don't know today, or they only live during this time of period. Next class, we'll talk about, I'm sorry, next presentation. Of course it happened, I'm sorry. We'll talk about the state fossil of New York, sea scorpions. Once again, only during this time period. They don't live till later. So none of these things ever saw dinosaurs. They lived before them. So dinosaurs lived in the past, so did all of ththese things. Here's a group of sponges that start in the Cambrian and die in the Cambrian. All right, so this first period, 540 million years ago to 400 and something, 470. So the Cambrian period has its own sponges that are now extinct. All right, so the sponges, they have a rich fossil history, which, we have other things to talk about other than sponges. So we're not going to go crazy on sponges, which, oh, I swear they're here somewhere. There. But there were different kinds, including some ones which are no longer with us, going back to like the beginning of animals. Now today, they're really good as filter feeders. So they suck in water, they let it pass through them with their little flagellae. And if there's any microbes or blue-green algae in it, then they'll eat it. All right, and then it goes back out. But they can't eat big things because water comes in those holes, goes out the big hole, but they have to eat it cell by cell. Like I don't do that. Like I put my food in a big stomach and I rip it apart, all right, and absorb it, but they have to eat it like cell by cell, so they can only eat microscopic stuff. So these are primitive things. Just one last thing to show you how primitive they are. I'll go back to here. They can make sperm and ova, but then again, I mean, that goes way back, so that's not impressive. That goes, back to amoebas and stuff. And I look here, one thing I notice is they don't have gonads. Any part of a sponge's body can make sex cells. You can make sex cells over here, over here, over here. But the next group changes that. So I just want to put that highlight here. So I want to talk about the next group. However, this is the quick overview. Sponges are very simple. But here's another group. They're like almost microscopic. So we could argue about where they fit in the family tree. Are they just before sponges? Are they just after sponges? They're called placozoans. Almost no one has ever heard of them. They move, but they don't have muscles and they don't have a nervous system, but they can still move and control their movement. So that's kind of interesting. And they secrete to do that signals. And we're okay, great, signals are great. But the signals fall into a kind of molecule that we call neuropeptides. We use neuropeptides in our brains. All right, so they don't have a nervous system, they don't have nerves or muscle, but they're controlling their movement using signaling molecules kind of like ours. So fascinating stuff. But unfortunately, we have to move on, because then we get to another group called the cnidarians. Now, I could go on, but this is the quick overview. As we talk about animals, we then break it into like these families. And so like here's a group and a group within them. So notice sponges are not in this group called the metazoans, but jellyfish and their friends are. So when I look at a jellyfish, look, they move. They have muscle. I'm not being kind and generous, like, oh, let's call it muscle. Not like our muscle, but for generous. No, those are muscle cells using the same cells, the same actions as we do. They have nerve cells that conduct electricity to tell the muscles to contract. All right, they don't have a brain, but nevertheless, they're controlling their movement. They have eyes. And you ask, what does a jellyfish see? The answer is nothing. The eyes aren't there for vision, but rather just to detect light and dark. So they have very simple eyes. Once again, I love this because, once again, this is conceited, but I'm impressed with my brain and my eyes and by extension yours. And here I can see a starting point. Very simple eyes that don't do vision yet. They just detect light or dark. All right, or nervous systems that are made of nerve nets and not brains and spinal cords. Fascinating. All right, just one other thing before we leave this group, just to show, when I think there's a hormone called oxytocin. When I hear the term oxytocin, I'm thinking of mammals, right? Oxytocin is the signal for orgasm. It is the signal for live birth. It is oxytocin during labor that causes uterine muscles to contract. Oxytocin causes the ejection of milk, all right? Mammal thing. Oxytocin is also what you feel when you're with people that you trust, among friends. I just like being in social groups. Oxytocin, that's a mammal thing. You can find its homologue though in jellyfish. So once again, mammals do mammal things with this hormone, but they didn't invent the hormone. They just took a hormone that the invertebrates had invented hundreds of millions of years before the first mammal, and then just applied it to new fancy things. So another thing to get out of invertebrates, like I said, is slowly seeing like the more complex body plans coming into um, to stage or into development. Now, there's lots of kinds of these jellyfish relatives, jellyfish corals, other things here. They tend to be predators, all right? And they tend to have like this space. So like when a jellyfish ingests something, often after stinging it with and paralyzing it, it puts it in this space where it digests it and then breaks it down and absorbs it. And that's what I do in my stomach. Like I don't have my cells try to eat like a peanut butter sandwich or a chicken fajita. I put them in a bag of acid where it's broken down. That's what they do. All right. And so there's this group. They don't have organs. All right. So they have nervous systems or they have muscles, but they don't have true organs. Some are colonial, like these little guys. All right. All hanging out in a group. If you were to look, maybe even in your pool, but certainly in a lake, you can see this little guy called a hydra. It's got these tentacles for little stinging cells where it could like sting like water bugs and maybe a fish. And then these give us, all, so there's another hydra. And then this gives us a whole set of things, including the jellyfish. All right. Now, jellyfish, I over Christmas, I swam through a bunch of them. So like, there's that. But then there are some that get so big that, instead of preying on fish, they can actually take the lives of humans with all their stinging cells. So this is a Portuguese man of war. They can get to be huge with their drifting tentacles, 60 feet long. And if you were swimming, you would certainly steer clear of those because it hurts when jellyfish sting you. But if you were wrapped in these, tentacles that just, you would be in a world of hurt as you mess with these things. I want to get back to another group of these, but let me just jump to another group. Jellyfish are one thing, but then there's another thing called comb jellies that are different. And we could argue about where to put them in the family tree. That's a jellyfish. You're about to see the other one. But let's not argue, just saying this is a comb jelly. A lot of jellyfish are fluorescent. And let me tell you what I mean by that. Fluorescent means I suck up the light that's in this room, and later, maybe tonight or at my leisure, I spit it out again, maybe a slightly different color. So like I take in light and I spit it back out. That's what fluorescence is. These comb jellies are bioluminescent. They make their own light in areas where there are none. So they can be deep inside the ocean and just generate light in a world that doesn't have light. They move by cilia only, and they are the largest animals that's the way that they move. So they're kind of like jellyfish, but they're not in the jellyfish group. And we could argue, are they like slightly before, slightly after? That's like slightly closer to the higher animals. We could argue those. The jellyfish and their friends include this one other group that I must mention, right? Corals. Now, what is a coral? Now, some of you came late and you don't know what a coral is, but for those of you who are early, I sang the coral reef song, so you're experts. Corals are animals, all right? Little tiny animals that live in colonies. So when you look at a coral reef, think of it as an apartment building, more or less, where all of these little holes, you know what? I'm sorry, I do have. I apologize. I make so many videos that then they don't always end up in the right places. And it occurs to me that might be one of them. So let me just, what would I have called that? There we go. So if you were to look at a coral, and we have coral, I can pull out in the back if anyone would like. You'll see all these holes. All right. All right. So those are real corals. So you'll see all these holes, and before I color them in with an animation, that's where a tiny little colonial animal lives. All right. So there, you see all the holes? In life, there are little coral animals living there. All right. So here are all the holes. You see little coral animals living there. So it's like an apartment complex. Every one of those little holes are just full of these tiny little things. Now, they have these little tentacles. They can sting. They can catch their own prey. But that is almost entirely not how they eat. All right. Most of their food is not gotten that way. Most of their food comes through photosynthesis. because inside the animals, these are animals, but inside the animal cells, they have algae living inside the cells, and they make a deal. The animal cell says, hey, I'll give you a place to live, this nice coral reef. Whereas the algae says, hey, I'll do photosynthesis. I'll use sunlight to make sugar. That's where over 90% of a coral gets its energy, which is why they're so great. Because if you look at the Caribbean, as much as I love it, the waters are really nutrient poor. All right. So if you couldn't live on sunlight, you really wouldn't do well. All right. If you're like starting off an organism, but if you can use photosynthesis and sunlight, well, then the corals are growing. And now the corals, they are so important for everybody else. All right. So a quarter of Earth's fish spend part of their lives in coral reefs. Now, you might not be impressed by that. All right. That I say, a quarter of Earth's, here, I'll just have some Caribbean corals going on in the background. You might not be impressed by a quarter of the ocean's fish being in corals, but, and you see how colorful they are. That's the algae. It's the algae, just like we have green plants here and red, at an autumn, those pigments are trapping sunlight. That's why we see the colors. Those are the pigments that are doing the photosynthesis inside these animals. How much coral reef is there in the ocean? Tragically, not a lot. If you were to put all the coral reefs together in all of the Earth's oceans, and the oceans are huge, the Pacific is huge, it would equal the state of New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, period. Now, when you think the size of the Pacific, the Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, that's not a lot of space for a quarter of the ocean's fish to depend on. So A, that's scary, but then the fact that we humans are doing so many things that damage the coral reefs, hence the song, that is another thing. So coral reefs are so incredibly important. And tragically, a whole bunch of things like us raising the temperature, us making severe storms more common, us using cyanide and explosives to fish with. Now, that's not usually us, that's more of a Southeast Asia thing. But erosion, all of these things that humans are doing is making them die. So you see how rich a coral reef is with the diversity of fish. If you've ever scuba or snorkeled, and there are some places you can snorkel, like there's a place just as the Keys start. If you, I think it's called Camp Pennicamp in Florida. The snorkeling is almost as good as scuba. So if you don't want to do the whole scuba thing, you can go places where the snorkeling is almost as good. All right, and you see like this incredible diversity of life thanks to the coral reefs. But there are places where they are bleaching. See the lack of colors? All right, the coral reefs are being affected by human activity, and you just don't get the same diversity of fish. All right, so just like we worry about tropical rainforests as the most diverse ecosystems on Earth, coral reefs are like that in the ocean. And just as we go through these groups of animals, these are tiny little simple animals, but nevertheless, just so foundational for the diversity of, hi, welcome, of the ocean's ecosystems. All right, and so if you were going in the Caribbean, there are hard corals, there are soft corals, and just a joy to be able to observe them. One of the interesting things that I've said, there have been corals for a very long time, but not these. These are like since the days of the dinosaurs. If you were to go like when corals first started, there are some groups which are no longer with us. The tabulate corals, the rugose corals, et cetera. All right, and this can be a discussion of later classes. I don't mean to be like negative. I don't want anyone to be like sad and not come to the future classes, but just so you know, 250 million years ago, it was a hard time. In fact, it was the worst time to be alive on planet Earth. We think that about 90% of life died at the end of what's called the Permian period. So when I had this little, I swear here's something there. No, where'd you go? I swear I had you. Oh, there we go. So this Paleozoic era in blue from 540 to 250 million years ago, this ends with a mass extinction. Like there's another mass extinction that does in the dinosaurs where the green period ends. But 90% of the life at the end of the blue period doesn't make it into the age of dinosaurs. So lots of things die out. So between this class and next, we'll say, oh, here's a bunch of corals. Yeah, they don't make it. Here's the trilobites. The last of them don't make it. Here's the sea scorpions. The last of them don't make it. Because 90% of life dies out at that time period. All right, but as we go forward, there are there's another group that is now metazoans, are animals that exclude the sponges. But within them, we could make another group called the bilaterians, which would exclude the jellyfish and their friends. So what we're doing, and so this hopefully is obvious by the end of this series of presentations. I would like to end up with just us in a bubble. So like having more or less addressed all of life on Earth, but getting into smaller groups and smaller groups and smaller groups with just us. All right. So as we classify life, it's not you get a chance to be in just one group. We are vertebrates. And within the vertebrates, we are mammals. And within the mammals, we are primates, et cetera. So there are groups within groups. So that's what we're kind of seeing here. We're starting out with animals as a broad category, and then just going into subgroup, 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 and slowly getting closer to ourselves. Although, we won't get to human evolution until the very end. But one of the things, once again, I'm kind of conceited, and I look at these guys. I love these guys. Because they decided, you know what we should do from now on? It's not just like go this way when the current takes us this way and go this way when the current takes us this way. No, the heck with that, because that's why you don't have a brain. Like if you just float any which way, where would you put a brain? You wouldn't. Where would you put your eyes? You'd have to put them everywhere. So you just kind of have to have eyes on this side if you happen to be floating this way, and eyes on this side if you happen to be floating this way. But they'd all be really simple because you wouldn't want to, invest all of your resources in any one. But once you make the decision, you know what? For the rest of life, we are going this way. This is forward. I am going this way from this point on. Well, you tend to put your taste stuff there and more touch stuff there. And rather than eyes all over the place, you just need, let's say 2 up here, but now they can get bigger and more complex and actually work on vision as opposed to just light from dark. And if you're going to have all of these sensory structures, you need to organize it. So now you have a brain. So it was the worms who invented the brain and worms who invented the head. And there are so many kinds of worm now. Some of you may already be all songed out, but I'll just this is a little plug. I'm just going to play a second of it. All right. But I don't know if you've ever had a presentation, all right, where someone wrote a song for you. So last night at the end of the Super Bowl, this was loaded on the internet. It is a brand new song. We'll just hear a second of it. I swear we'll hear. Oh, okay. Why is there no sound here? All right. Well, it's coming.
And harder drastic, the organs for excretion, respiration, only one opening for digestion, according to this criteria, the most basal branch, bilateria.
So yes, I decided that the bass and the banjo would go along together for a worm song. But in any case, so the song is, there are so many different kinds of worm. So I'm going to start to talk about worms, but that's an important place to start. When I say worm, that's not a real biological term. By that, I mean, here are worms and there are worms and there are worms, and they're not closely related. Some are very simple, some are very complex. So just because I'm talking about worms, please don't think that they're all the same. There are some which seem to be just one step up from jellyfish. Everyone can agree that. All right. So they're just like their brain is maybe 4 cells big. They still have all these primitive features. So we can all agree on this, and the agreement's about to end, that these worms are the most primitive animals which are bilaterally symmetrical. So let me just explain what I mean by that. If you want to cut a pizza in half, you've got options. You can do it this way, you can do it this way. You want to cut a jellyfish in half, you got the same options. They are radially symmetrical. If you want to cut a squirrel in half, all right, you have one option to do it this way. to create left and right halves, because otherwise the halves aren't really equal. Top and bottom squirrel aren't the same thing. And same thing would apply to dragonflies, the same thing would apply to, fish, etc. So these worms evolve what's called bilateral symmetry, where you're symmetrical left and right, as opposed to the radial symmetry or the lack of symmetry, which we saw in the first animals. So these worms, they do stuff, all right, but they're still very primitive. Then after this, there are more worms. Now, let just my own time. You do not want to hear me rant and rave for half an hour, so I'll make this 20 seconds. I'm older, all right, and I'll just speak for myself. I kind of get accustomed to my ways, all right. But in science, you can't ever be too accustomed to things because there might be a new study that says, no, I think our former conclusions, we have to reconsider that. And in your heart, that's the deal with science, but still it annoys you when it happens. So the problem is, for centuries, and certainly, for a long time, biologists have studied animal life based on their anatomy and grouped them based on their anatomy. Great. But in recent decades, the geneticists come around and say, anatomy, who even needs to look at the whole organism? We just sequence their genes and compare them and make family trees based on that. And there are times where the anatomists say, this is the classification scheme that makes sense. We'll put these guys together. And the geneticists say, no, it doesn't. We want to do it some other way. And then they fight and argue. And I have very strong opinions, on some of how these have turned out. We need not to go here. But suffice it to say, we're not quite sure after that first branch where all of the other branching happens. The geneticists seem to be taking the day, but it's kind of weird. So that's all I'm going to say about the controversy. So there are some different groups of worms, and I'm just going to now start throwing them at you at no particular order. These are flatworms. Okay, we have them living in. That was one I think I filmed in the Delaware. So they're in this little pond right out here. So planaria, like the one you just saw, they're here. They've got eyes that are better than jellyfish eyes. Are they advanced? Well, I'll let you can come to your own judgment. So where is the mouth? It's actually here in the middle of their body, right? Same as where you would find it on a jellyfish, all right? Where is their anus? Same place. So they have one opening, food comes in and waste goes out, all right? So this is what we call, it's a simple digestive system. It would be later worms that say, there's a better way to do it. You could have two ends to this, et cetera. But that's not how the jellyfish do it. And that's not how a lot of the worms do it. So here, even though they have a head, the mouth isn't there. And they have one common opening for food and air. And there's just like all these weird things. So believe it or not, this thing looks like it's segmented, but it's not. It's kind of like a same flatworm. And if you say, well, what are all those segments? This thing has just had lots of kids. And the kids are staying attached to the first one until at some point they'll decide to drop off. So it looks like this long one organism. It's actually a whole family tree. And at the back end, every now and then one will drop off and then start its own life here. So these are kind of crazy little, flatworms. And you're thinking, oh, I'm remotely interested in this. Unfortunately, there are reasons to be really interested in flatworms. And I try to tell my general biology 2 students, they're like, really, who cares? Like, I want to be a doctor. Why are we studying worms? The answer is because your patients will have them inside. All right. So in addition to the planarian, which are free living, this group of worms has 2 groups of parasites, the tapeworms and the flukes. So tapeworms get attached in intestines. They have a little hooker there, and then they make these segments called proglottids. And all they do is make eggs, just a gazillion eggs. So they don't really need to work on feeding. That's really not a mouth because they're living in intestines. They don't need to digest stuff. They're living in digested food. They just have to absorb it. All right. So they just absorb the stuff. And by the time their proglottids mature, all they are like egg producing factories. All right. So then people's intestines or cows or whoever, everybody can get tapeworms, just have nothing but these eggs, which are then passed outside of the body. That's one kind of parasitic flatworm. There are others. There are the flukes. Now, I've lived abroad, and so just one thing I'd like to say is just you grow up thinking what's normal, and then just to say like we here we're not normal. All right, if you were to ask does the average person of the 8 billion people alive today, how do they live? Not like us. All right. And I bring that up because if you were to say, do you care about flukes? I think a lot of you would say, no, never heard of them, don't care. But about 3 billion people have flukes inside them today. All right. They will cause hundreds of thousands of deaths. Flukes are crazy. So they are parasitic things. Like this one alone, schistosomiasis, is a fluke. 200 million cases a year. All right, 20 million develop severe disease, and 200,000 will die. And they go through all of these crazy life cycles. And let me just do a life cycle. So by life cycle, what I mean is, let's do. Okay, I'm sorry, I got so many. There's different kinds of flukes with different life cycles. So that's an adult. All right. So when the eggs are laid, do they end up looking like that? No, they look like these tiny little guys. And they're often in water. And who eats them? The snails. Oh, they love snails. So they want not only to have a host, they want to have multiple hosts over the course of their lives and look different in each one. So that's snail tissue with a fluke inside. So that's a worm now inside the snail. All right, so the snail is infected. They grow up, they lay eggs, and now these get dispersed in the water and produce guys that look like this. Right now, I don't like those. Luckily, I've never been around those because they're now swimming around in the water. All right, and they can burrow some of them through human flesh and then get in you. So if you were living in certain countries, well, then if you're wearing flip-flops and you're going through, muddy water or just like the soil's wet or whatever, all of a sudden, these from the snails could now be um, infecting you. Now, whether they're trying to aim for humans or they're trying to aim for some other animals and they get you by accident, then they burrow through your body and then like insist themselves. So they could end up like in your liver, they could end up in your muscles. So those are worms living inside human tissue, and they can make you horribly sick. All right, and just there are so many places which are hot where people walk through water. Like if you're farming in a rice paddy, what are you doing? You're in water. All right. You're actually in water that, is being fertilized by material which, isn't quite what we would fertilize, farms with. And there's going to be these things which can now work themselves um, into your bodies. So once again, just a quick thing, we can't spend too much time on any one group. But a lot of people have never given much thought to flatworms or to the diverse kinds. But once again, just billions of people have them now. All right. And they will just, so if you wanted to go into medicine, all right, depending on where your patients are, where you're traveling, just, these types of worms, they're just a serious threat to human health. But as I said, there are so many more. One type of worm that most people have never heard of are the nematodes. All right. Now, we could argue about how many kinds there are, like probably a gazillion. So, like, just here, nematodes probably outweigh all wild mammals and birds together, even though most of us don't probably know what they are. Even though they're around you all the time, you walk on them all the time, you swim with them. Most of them are microscopic. So, if you were to take pond water and then just put it under a microscope, you'd say, I see a worm. Those little wormy things swimming around. If you take soil that you just stepped on, add a little water, add a microscope, you see all these little wormy things. Now, some of these can get big. They can live in intestines. And these were one of the worms that lived in Paraguay that could infect people when I was there. And I did have worms. I'm not quite sure what kind. But a lot of them are just microscopic. And we certainly pay a lot of attention to like the parasite forms, but they're in parts of food chains, like they're eating bacteria and algae, but then water bugs eat them, and then the baby fish eat the water bugs. And so like if you enjoy bass or you love the bald eagle that just caught the big fish, even though you're not thinking of nematodes, they're in that mix somewhere. All right, so you have to go from the microscopic things which are doing photosynthesis somehow into animal life. Feel free to join us if that's what you're looking for. Here, so there's so many different kinds of nematodes. All right, just so many different kinds. So I've got videos on them and all of the um, of what they do. Just one little thing, and I'm not picking on anybody. Because I'm old. This is when I thought I was being all like modern, and I'm like, oh, there are 7 billion people on the planet. There's like now 8.2. So like, I should remake this video. But at the time, if you were to say of the 7 billion people, what type of like restrooms do they have? 4 of the 7 would either have this, which probably looks familiar, or this, a toilet over a cement block with a hole, or just a cement, plate with a hole. All of these, the United Nations would refer to as improved sanitation. So all of these 3 are good. All right. 2 of the 7 don't have those, and 1/7 would practice open defecation. So under those circumstances, once again, if we were to say, well, all of these invertebrates, all of these different kinds of disease, now you realize that, once again, we're not normal, all right? And the average person alive comes far closer to the conditions which so easily spread so many of these invertebrates. Okay. There are more. All right, we'll get back to worms, but there are things which are less wormy. There are these little bryozoans, big in the fossil times, a few still in the oceans. But if you've ever been in lakes in this area, you see what looks like our brains. That's a type of invertebrate called a bryozoan. Excuse me, living in a colony. So there's those. If you were to look under at pond water under the microscope, you'd see these other little animals. Like, this amazes me because, I mentioned this last time, we could pull out microscope slides of amoeba that you don't need a microscope to see. They're that big. But here are animals that you do need a microscope to see. So when we think about like one-celled organisms and animals, we tend to think animals huge, one-celled organisms small. But there are one-celled organisms which eat the animals, all right, because the animals are smaller than those. All right, so here's something called a rotifer, just filtering bacteria, blue-green algae out of the water. Okay. As we go through groups of worms, there's one kind we're very familiar with. All right, the earthworms. All right, and they're annelids. But here, I mentioned that some worms are really simple, right? Look at so this one has a mouth, a digestive tract with the different structures like a crop, a gizzard that grind the food, and intestine that ends in an anus. All right, so some worms just have a whole ear for mouth and anus. Here we have a complete system with all of these specialized regions along the way. Here we've got blood vessels and hearts. All right, nematodes don't have blood vessels or hearts. The flatworms don't. Here we have blood vessels and hearts. So even though they're worms, this is like centuries above, the other worms as far as complexity goes. Now, when I say heart and blood vessels, let me just be clear. All a heart needs to be is a blood vessel that does this every now and then. That's a heart. So what we have is a tube that has blood that comes up this way, a tube that has blood that goes this way, and then here we just have these side things which are pumping it. So there's just, the blood from here goes up, it turns around, the blood goes then back, and that's their circulatory system. Not as complex as ours, but they have a circulatory system, which the worms I've mentioned up till now don't. All right, I'm sorry, I think there's a chat question. In Fantasia, the fight between the T-Rex and the Stegosaurus could never have happened. All right, we'll talk about reptiles later, and we'll dedicate some time to that. Oh, actually, yes, but you're absolutely right. They lived at different times. I'm sorry, I see where you're going. Yes, stegosaurs were Jurassic and T-Rex was at the end of the Cretaceous, except, and I don't know this for a fact, for a while, India was its own little floating continent or subcontinent. And stegosaurs, where they went extinct everywhere else in the world, actually lived in India a little bit longer in the Cretaceous. But then again, like you said, T-Rex only lived in the Western US, so they never would have met. Very good, very good. So I have all of these images of earthworms, their blood vessels. But just if you were to look at some of those other worms, like nematodes under the microscope, you don't see any of those. You don't see a cavity. You don't see the blood vessels. This is a really complex worm compared to the other ones. And if I were to just remind you of, sorry, where did I put you? Anyway, if you were to say how much do all of the annelids weigh, I'm sorry. There we go. They weigh a lot. So the world is full of earthworms. So if you were to, all right, so there's all the people, there's all the livestock, there's the corals are, obviously pretty heavy. But if you were to throw earthworms in the mix, as we will in just a second, there we go. So annelids, they are the segmented worms. Look at those. So if you put all of the segmented worms on a scale, all right. So far we have humans, livestock, nematodes, wild mammals, wild birds, and then even the corals. And there's a lot of earthworms. So certainly a lot of Earth's diversity is them. Although there are other segmented worms which will pop up at me, I swear. There we go. So there are other relatives of earthworms like leeches. Like earthworms, they have segments. Now, some of these are free-living hunters, but a lot of these are ectoparasites. And let me go back to the song because I've got. Well, no, you deserve the full video. There's another one probably hasn't ended up in the folder it should yet. Leech. There you go. So here's a leech. But this leech, I found it, and just like the pictures, look at its blood vessels. Like you can actually see the blood pumping. So once again, lots of worms don't have this, but just as far as the complexity of this, you can see like the red pigment will kind of come and go. All right. So this is like earthworms in being in segmented. If you've ever had a leech on you, I certainly have. One of the things that they do is because they're sucking blood and they don't obviously want the blood to clot because that means their meal's over. So they want it not to clot. So they secrete anticoagulants. So if you ever took a leech off of you, you probably notice you look down an hour later, like I'm still bleeding into my sock because the blood's not clotting thanks to bleach and the anticoagulants that they made. But just, look, we can actually see blood pumping through blood vessels, which makes them so much more advanced than so many of the other worms. Okay. So of all of the ways that we could go, arthropods are just such a big group. They are the major topic for next week. So this will include sea scorpions, the insects, and all of that. And I did kind of have a question as to where to put another kind of worms, which actually start to have some of the features that fish have. And I was like, oh, does that fit in today or does that fit in next time? So definitely that'll be next time. So then there's one more group I'd like to introduce as we look at the invertebrates, and that is the mollusks. Now, that looks like a worm, all right? That looks fine. But it's got a little hard shell on this segment, on that segment, on that segment. So imagine an earthworm that just started making like little shelly, pieces on its various segments. There are still worms that kind of do that today called the chitins. This is where the mollusks started. Now, later mollusks would just like make one big shell like a snail or two big shells like a clam. All right, but nevertheless, they started with worms that just started to make more shelly versions of themselves. All right. If we were to go back in the fossil record, there are all these kinds of mollusks, including the armored squid. So when we eventually talk about fish, fish, they have it rough for a while. All right, because the first fish are this big and they don't have jaws, they don't have bone. But they live in a world that's filled with invertebrate predators. All right, some of these armored squid could get to be 12 feet long, sea scorpions 8 feet long, trilobites 6 feet long. So when vertebrates first appear, they are food for the invertebrates. All right, so another reason to talk about the invertebrates, they ruled for a while. All right, vertebrates would have to get jaws before they could start coming about. If you collect fossils throughout the world, we don't really have them as much here. You see all of these things that look like snails, but they're not. They would have had squid-like things living in them during the day. And during the Paleozoic, prior to that big mass extinction, these guys ruled. And in fact, in the age of dinosaurs, there was gazillions of these. So if you've seen the Jurassic Parks, you know that the dinosaurs got big, but there were things that got bigger. Like if you've seen the big marine thing, that like one of the Jurassic Parks ends, there's a whole bunch of surfers, and then there's like this big thing swimming in the wave behind them. So there were these marine lizards that could get to be 50 feet long. That's a big lizard, 50 feet. And they lived at a time where these guys, these armored squid, were still floating around, and they could eat them. And in the mass extinctions, most of the armored squid have died, except for the nautilus. That is one remnant of the group, which is still alive today. So this is an ancient group, the mollusks. And if you were alive early in times, like, they were dominant predators long before the fish were. There are some members of this group, the octopi and the squid. They have largely lost their shells, except for the and I'm sorry, I still want to look it up. Just so you know, I have checked this a gazillion times. Just to be clear, octopi is not a word. Octopuses is. All right. So if anyone thinks I've misspelled, technically, like, just I still don't believe it. I still look it up, but apparently octopuses, that's the word, not octopi. Um, but these things have lost their shells, and obviously there's an advantage to that. So, you can squeeze into tight spaces and go after, your prey if you don't have a hard shell. This octopus is very good at changing the color of its skin so it can blend in as well. These guys are really smart. So I don't know whether you have been following like the Finding Nemo, Finding Dory stories, or whether you've taken people to the theaters who were. But one thing in Finding Dory was accurate as far as like the octopi coming out of their tanks. So this has happened where people keep all their fish tanks, and they'll be like, oh, we'll put the octopus over here away from all of the fish. And in the middle of the night, the octopus will creep out of its tank, go down, go across the floor, go into the other tanks, eat the fish, leave, go back. And then the people come the next day and they're like, where did they go? It's happened. Octopi are really, really smart. So um, they are mollusks. A lot of mollusks are a little humbler than that. One big group are the snails. They have one shell. And then there are the bivalves that have two. One thing that they have or two things that they have in common is they make a shell using a tissue called the mantle. So here I've taken a clam, and when you remove the shell, there's this very thin layer right underneath the shell. That's what's called the mantle, and that's what makes the shell. So there's a tissue that makes the shell. Here is a golden clam. It's an invasive species in our area. But the tissue that you see just inside the shell, it's kind of a light white color. That is the mantle that is making the shell. Then they have a muscular structure called a foot. What does one use a foot for? So here are just shells. You can make one half, you can make two halves. You can split a foot into tentacles. So the squid and the octopi do that. Or you can crawl along it with slugs and snails. So here you see a snail, and what it's crawling on is the muscular foot. Okay, here's a land snail that I filmed right outside of one of our buildings here. So, we live in such a great area. You never know, like, just what beautiful wildlife you're going to see. But here you can see a little clam and see the thing sticking out. It's going to make a hole and burrow using its foot. So that's another molluscan feature, that you've got this muscular thing called a foot. And whether you use to burrow with it like a clam, or glide along it like a snail, or break it into tentacles, that's your business. Now, I apologize. Some of you are probably envious and angry, all right, because like you got here a few minutes late and you didn't get the bivalve song, all right. So let me just kind of do the quick synapse of what the bivalve song was about. Because if you're asking, I want to understand clam anatomy. Before I leave, I swear I will understand clam anatomy. This is how clam anatomy works. There are two holes. Water comes in one of them, water goes out the other one. All right, so hence the suck in the water, suck out the water. So here you can see clams just sucking water, spitting out water. And this water then goes over their gills, so that's how they breathe. right? And so if you're a clam, I mean, some of them, they'll actually burrow in the sand, but these will be like attached to these long tubes. So that's a good way to protect yourself from predators, because like you're not actually where predators can find you. You're actually burrowed in the sand, but you're still breathing and eating, as I'll see. So here you have the water comes in, the water goes out, and there's cilia, right? So we got all these little cilia up here that are like just waving the water on, and the water goes through these tubes. So the water's flowing through the body. It comes in this hole, goes over the gills, goes out that hole. But as the water comes in, it's probably got algae in it, or bacteria, or little critters and stuff like that. And so then the cilia sweep that towards the mouth, so that then you can pump that into the stomach and the intestines. And so that's how you eat. So the water comes in, the water leaves. Not only is that where you're getting your oxygen, it's also where you're getting your food. And heck, if the water's about to leave through that hole, why not put your anus there? Why not get rid of your waste there? Heck, if you've got kids or gametes, and some release their gametes in the water, some fertilize them, keep them inside their shell, and then release their kids. Why not release the kids through the hole as well? So that flow of water is how they breathe, it's how they eat, it's how they transport gametes and offspring. All right, and I'm okay, so I'm going to be like a little shameless here for a second. Some of you, there were two lines in the songs earlier, and this is just purely being egotistical, I'd like to highlight because they are among the best rhymes for these words that I think have ever occurred. So here, there was a line that said, gametes, the exhalant siphon can get rid of ya. Same thing for tiny offspring called Glaucidia, which is one of the best Glaucidia lines I've ever heard, I think. But anyway, if you wonder what a baby clam looks like, it looks like this. They're called Glaucidia. And one of the interesting things in our area, like the Delaware has a lot of mussels. And fish will go up to a mussel and like, hey, can I eat you? And some do, like eels do. But what the mussels will do is they just spit their kids at the fish. And the Glaucidia, they latch onto the gills, and they don't do much harm, like unless there was a gazillion of them. They're just hitchhikers. They're not really damaging the fish. And then the fish swim somewhere else and they drop off. So the mussels actually depend on fish to help transport their kids. So that's one thing. That's Glaucidia. And then one other rhyme that I'm rather proud of is the corals. They're algae that live inside are called zooxanthellae. But because of a lot of human activity, like when we make water anoxic and like just there's garbage and like just it's foul water, the coral bleaches. And so one of the lines was, in water that's smelly, we lose our zooxanthellae. Once again, one of the best zooxanthellae rhymes I've ever heard. So the invertebrates, all right, they have more species than all other animals combined. In fact, 4 groups of insects have more species than all other animals combined. So they're worth mentioning for that reason. If we were to put animals on a scale, all right, when you put, I mean, yes, the arthropods, but then the annelids and the nematodes and the corals, just so much more than the mammals and the humans. And so just in terms of biomass, there's so much of the invertebrates. If you want to talk about history, all right, well, they come first. All right, hundreds of millions of years before mammals, and 150 million years before vertebrates. There are invertebrates, so they come first. They rule even when there are fish. The first fish were scared out of their minds of these huge armored squid and these sea scorpions and all of these things. But then one last reason, like there's plenty of others, like in ecosystems or parts of food chains, they cause disease. So invertebrates are worth, studying, for all of these reasons. Invasive species like spotted lanternflies can be a problem. Bees are pollinating so much, so we can get into a lot of that again next time. But once again, just being egotistical, all right, if the vertebrates are up here, so many of the things which will make the vertebrates complex, it's these guys that are multicellular with collagen, these guys that invent nerve and muscle tissue, these guys that say, hey, we could have a head and a brain. Then, along here, we get body cavities, complete digestive systems, etc. If I like our vertebrate complexity, so much of it is an elaboration on what the invertebrates developed before. So for a whole host of reasons, invertebrates are fun to talk about. And this was part one. Part two will be mostly arthropods. But once again, just being biased, at a certain point, I'm like, all right, bugs are neat, mollusks are neat. But what about the vertebrates? What about our half of the family tree? I don't know if you can see that guy. That's a worm. But this worm is not related to those worms on that half of the family tree, nor are these nematode worms over there, nor are these earthworms, nor are those flatworms. That one's actually closer to the fish. And if we're asking, well, how did fish get to be fish? All right, at the end of next presentation, we'll actually start off with, well, how were fish built? All right, so there are invertebrates which seem to get fish features, and so we'll end with that next time. If anyone has any questions, feel free to stay. Other than that, thank you so much for coming, and we'll see you next week if you'd like. As I always say, if anyone would like a calendar from one of our local environmental organizations, any donation, feel free to take the calendars. And then there's, I think, the lecture series that we're doing. If anyone wanted a calendar of that. Did anybody have any questions? Yes.
Yes. Why is the tree of life so tall rather than being bushy? Like,
Good.
do you see my meaning?
Uh-huh.
Like, it seems like it was going in a certain direction, and yet those nematodes have just as long to evolve as we did.
So that's an excellent question. I would answer it by two things. One, me being biased and impressed with myself. I want the nematodes to have a branch because I want me to fit on there. Like if you fit all of the nematode branches going, way back, so like it would look like a bush, but then I'd look small. And I don't like that, so the arthropods, once again, the moths, the wasps, the beetles, and the flies, as many species as all other life combined. So if this were accurate, you wouldn't see me. And why would I make a family tree where you can't see me? So in part, it's not an accurate one. Like we're trying to understand it, like it's depicting life how we would like to see it, because we'd like to see our place in it. But if we were less egocentric and just depicting it, the way that life actually is, there would just be so many more branches, and it would actually be much bushier, as you mentioned. One other reason, and there's a horrible reason, but an answer to your question, is literally in the past couple of decades has been a time where how we put all of this together. So this video goes along with when I was in school, this was the tree of life. Now what I have to teach my students, even though I only 90% agree with it, is this is the tree of life. And the point is we're now getting more and more genetic sequences and using that to classify this. So just like I make videos, people write textbooks, but then you have to redo it because someone publishes something and like, no, we just did some genetic analyses of this group of marine worms that no one's ever heard of, and we think they belong over here. And then you rework it, and then 3 years later, someone says, no, we just redid that study. We want to go back to and it drives you crazy. So I think nematode diversity is not as widely studied as it could be, as with moths, et cetera. There's just so many live in the ocean, at the nematodes especially. The most common place you'll find them are like the bottom sediments of the ocean. So as you can imagine, there's a lot out there that we haven't studied well. I think that's a nice family tree, because otherwise I'd say there are 5 groups of nematodes, and then 3 years later I'd have to revise it, and 2 years after that I'd have to revise it. So a lot of these other things, so much of the life lives in the rainforest. And then so when we get to insects and moths, if I were to try to come up with a family tree of moths or flies, the better we understand Brazil, we'd redo the whole family tree. So I think that's an excellent question. I think you're right. I think it's far more of a bush than a tree. I think depicting it this way helps me more than attempts to accurately depict that. That would be my answer. Anybody else? Any questions? Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you very much.
Any questions at home? I see something in the chat. Thank you. Oh, wonderful. Looking forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you.
Familiar with a book, Why Fish Don't Exist?
No.
Lulu Miller.
Lulu Miller. Okay.
You got it.
Okay.
It fits right in with your.
Okay. Is it, like the premise,
Chaos and the
Okay.
fact that a whole collection of the standards
uh-huh,
by which they named things
mhm,
crashed and burned in a big fire.
okay,
And so they had no standard by which to judge anymore, to identify things.
okay. Oh, I like that because I ask my students, do you consider yourself a
Read.
fish? And I make the point, well, you're descended from the first fish just like everybody else, and if you
Yeah.
don't, fish isn't a biological word.
Well, the
That's it.
first fish in this collection apparently was destroyed in this, whatever happened.
Oh, okay,
It's a great book.
Okay,
Really
okay.
fantastic. Lulu Miller. is
Lulu
the
Miller,
name.
okay, let me make it.
And the other one I was wondering, do you, a book called Origins?
Maybe,
It's about tectonic activity and how
Oh,
that
okay.
formed life.
okay,
Guy's name is, oh, no. It's just, that's the name of the book, Origins. You can look it up. It's
Okay.
not, it's a couple of years old.
Okay.
But
Well,
it's
thank you.
really, really good.
Thank you for
They-
sharing.
They fit right in. I was thinking, you should think about doing a thing on mycology and as far as mass in the
Uh-huh.
world goes.
We will mention those, there is
I
a
think there
lecture
is
coming
one, I
up,
saw
yeah,
that, yeah.
yeah. So I, like, with my students, I do like, an hour class on psychology, but I mean, you're absolutely right. So they deserve so much more than that.
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you.
Dr. J,
Hey,
by
hi, great to
chance-
see you.
Just by chance.
Sure.
Would you have Amy's telephone number?
I don't have Amy's phone number. I just have
Tell
an
me she
email.
was gonna be in.
Okay, I have an email.
email.
Oh, okay.
She told me she was gonna be here this week, so she didn't show up, so maybe next week I'll try again.
If it's a lot of trouble to hold, I'd be happy. I have to sprint in a second, but I'd be happy to put it in my office for you. If it was a problem to. All right, sorry, I'm gonna stop recording. Stop recording. Okay,
Here you go.
great. I'll put it in my office.
Got everything ready.